All right, so to review what's happened so far is you start off this chapter with you had a monarchy, Louis XVI, and you had three estates in a very unfair social structure. Eventually, the third estate declares themselves the National Assembly, the voice of the people, because they represent 98% of the people, and you still had a monarchy. Eventually, that National Assembly creates a constitution in 1791, which was very unpopular with many, in part because it limited voting rights based on how much taxes that you paid. And so eventually, the Sans Culottes, a radical element within Paris, storms the National Assembly, or Legislative Assembly, excuse me, and announces the creation of a national convention based on universal male suffrage. So we were about to enter in a more radical stage of the French Revolution. This started off first as a revolution of the nobility, then a revolution basically ran by the bourgeoisie, the upper middle class. Now we're moving to a more radical stage. And one of the first things that they did is on September 21st, 1792, they abolished or ended the monarchy. So King Louis is no longer King Louis, right? And that's going to lead to another question about what to do with their former king. And this national convention ends up being split into two factions, two rival groups, the Girondins and the Mountain, also called the Jacobeans. Now, both groups were pro revolution. They just disagreed on what direction that revolution should follow. The Girondins were supported by the countryside. They are more moderate. They favored letting the king live, for instance. The Mountain, the Jacobeans, they were supported by the cities, particularly Paris. They were more radical. They favored executing the king, and eventually they come to dominate the government because the National Convention met in Paris, and Paris was essentially ran by the Paris Commune, and the Paris Commune was ran by the Sans Culottes, who were not afraid to use violence and intimidation to basically get what they want, to force the Girondins out of power. And so what begins to happen is all these problems keep arising. There were continuing bread shortages. There's still an economic crisis. There were huge chunks of France in rebellion against the revolution in places like in the Vendée, the city of Nantes. The city of Toulon actually opened up its harbor to the British Navy and allowed the British to take over the city, for instance. So this revolution has becomes more and more radical and less Christian, and executing the king. It becomes more and more unpopular in other parts of France, particularly outside of Paris, particularly outside the major cities. And so there are big chunks of France in rebellion. They're also still fighting a war. It started off with Austria, and now they're fighting multiple enemies. They're fighting the Austrians, they're fighting the British, they're fighting the Prussians, they're fighting the Italian states, and they are surrounded by enemies, and they are losing. Right. So the solution to the problem was to create a special committee called the Committee of Public Safety that essentially had the power of a dictatorship. It started off as a committee, a group of men, and they were given the power to do whatever necessary to solve all of these problems, crush the internal rebellion, and defeat the external enemies. But eventually, this committee will become dominated by one man, right? So during the reign of terror, you kind of have almost like a holy trinity of terror, right? You have a man named Marat. He was not a politician exactly. He was a journalist. He was the publisher of a newspaper called Friend of the People, which was a radical, pro-revolutionary newspaper. It was Marat who published the story that King Louis and Marie Antoinette threw that party and walked on the tricolor that led to the March of the Fisherwomen. And Marat always was calling for more blood and more execution and more violence, and he is a supporter of the terror and very popular among the radical revolutionaries. Then you have Georges Danton, a member of the Committee of Public Safety, who said, "Terror shall be the order of the day." And he too favored the use of terror and violence to crush the internal rebellions. And then there's Maximilien Robespierre, the incorruptible, as he was nicknamed, who will come to be the leader of the Committee of Public Safety. whose goal will be to save the revolution and in his mind create what he called a republic of virtue. But he believed that to get to that republic of virtue, you are going to have to use ruthless violence and terror to do it. Now, eventually, Marat, he is going to be murdered by the young lady you see on the screen there, named Corday. She was from the French countryside. She supported the Girondins, and she murdered Marat when he was in his bath. He spent most of his day in a medicinal bath. He had his painful skin condition that he contracted when he used to live in the sewers of Paris when he was homeless. And with Marat's execution, this gives Danton and Robespierre and the Jacobeans the excuse they need to ratchet up the terror, because they can say, "See, we told you, right? These internal enemies are dangerous. We need to do something about them." And so they begin to crush those internal rebellions. The French army begins to fight against French people in the Vendée. In the city of Nantes, there are mass executions by cannon fire. There are mass drownings. And of course, in places like Nantes and Lyon, and particularly Paris, the guillotine is running nonstop. It's really hard to get an exact count of how many died during the terror. Tens of thousands at the very least. And ironically enough, the majority of the people executed weren't nobility, the ones that had stayed and hadn't fled yet, and they weren't clergy. They were actually commoners. By and large, right? And so they begin to use violence to ruthlessly crush the terror. And if you were seen as too moderate, you'd be executed as well. Eventually, Danton encourages an end to the terror, and Robespierre has him arrested and sent to the guillotine. Robespierre has most of the Girondins arrested and sent to the guillotine. Anyone who was found lacking, anyone who did not support the revolution enough, so to speak, could be a victim of the terror. And so remember, Robespierre is doing all this because he argues he's trying to create a republic of virtue, a republic in which all would be equal, right? A republic in which logic and order would rule the day and justice would rule the day. And there are many aspects of this Republic of Virtue. Some of them were good. The Republic under Robespierre began to offer free education to all. They tried to take care of the rising number of orphans during this time period. Aspects of it were good. The idea of trying to create an equal France, there's nothing wrong with that. It's how they go about it that is questionable. Now, another part of this Republic of Virtue was to de-Christianize France. The church was seen as the enemy of the revolution because the Pope had condemned the revolution, for instance, and the clergy, for centuries had special privileges that the commoners resented, and Christianity was seen as illogical by some. So part of this effort was, if a street name had the word saint in it, it was taken down and renamed. They redefined the calendar. The dividing point in history was no longer the birth of Christ, it was the creation of the French Republic. They changed the names of the months to represent the seasons because I thought that was more logical. They changed the days of the week from 7 days to 10 days in a week because I thought that was more logical. Also, what used to be Sunday would fall in the middle of the week, would no longer be a special day. And now there was a debate on what to replace Christianity with. At first, they tried this cult of reason, which was not really a religion, more of a atheistic organization that promoted citizenship. But Robespierre was not a fan of that. He was a deist. In fact, he had the guy that created the cult of reason arrested and guillotined. And Robespierre tries to replace the cult of reason with the cult of the supreme being, this deistic organization. It was never tremendously popular either. And much of Europe was aghast at this, trying to actively destroy Christianity was just out of bounds for most of Europe.